Welcome to the Explainer. Normally I like to kick things off by laying out a clear roadmap of exactly what we're going to cover today, but we're completely skipping the agenda this time. I really want to preserve the absolute mystery of this one, because we are looking at a truly bizarre true crime and medical puzzle. We're going to piece together the story of a completely erased mind, a massive biological manhunt, and a staggering 27-year missing gap in a human being's life.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Picture this. You wake up. You have absolutely no idea where you are. You have zero memory of how you even got there. And perhaps most terrifying of all, you don't even know your own name. I mean, it sounds exactly like a plot from a daytime soap opera or some intense psychological thriller, right? But this actually happens. And when it happens in a completely unfamiliar place, away from anyone who knows you, well, actually, scratch that. It's more like a living nightmare. This is the exact horrifying scene we're stepping into today. The date is August 31st, 2004, and the location is behind a Burger King dumpster in Georgia.
Early that morning, an employee showed up for work and found a man just lying there on the ground. And the poor guy was in a brutal state. He was severely beaten, completely naked, and covered in this awful rash from biting ants. He was completely unconscious, and when the paramedics finally arrived, he was just deeply incoherent. Once they got him to the hospital, the medical staff had absolutely no clue who they were treating. Missing persons reports, nothing. Fingerprints, zero matches. Because he was found out behind a Burger King, the nurses initially just started calling him BK Doe. It wasn't until a bit later, after he was moved to a homeless shelter in Savannah, that he decided he really didn't want to be called BK anymore. He settled on the name Benjamin, spelled with an N-E-N-E at the end, bizarrely enough, just because he felt this weird, unexplained connection to it. He adopted the last name Kyle. And literally just like that, Benjamin Kyle was born out of thin air.
Now, what's really fascinating about human memory and severe amnesia is that your mind doesn't just become a perfectly clean slate. You think it does, right? Like someone just wiped the hard drive. But that's not how the brain works at all. Major life events, wives, kids, hometowns, entire past careers, those can completely vanish into the dark. Yet the brain holds tightly onto the most randomly specific, fragmented puzzle pieces imaginable. As the nurses at the shelter worked with Benjamin, just trying to jog his memory, these weird, disjointed little fragments actually started floating up to the surface. Incredibly, while he couldn't name a single family member, his brain had locked on to these highly specific fragments from his past. He vividly remembered being a kid and buying 25-cent grilled cheese sandwiches at the Indiana State Fair. He remembered moving to Boulder, Colorado right before this massive flood happened. He even remembered the local food scene. Like, he specifically loved a restaurant called Mama Alana's and absolutely hated a place called Azar's. He even recalled sitting in a Denver theater watching the 1976 movie Car Wash. So these incredibly specific fragments essentially drew up a ghostly geographical footprint across Indiana and Colorado. But none of it amounted to an actual name.
And then there was the whole birthday thing. Benjamin somehow knew for a fact that he was born on August 29th, 1948. But think about that. How do you remember your exact birthday when you literally can't remember your own name? Well, it all came down to this bizarre mathematical association his brain had locked away. He only remembered his birthday because he knew, just as a piece of pure trivia, that he was born exactly 10 years to the day before the pop star Michael Jackson. Isn't that wild? It is an amazing illustration of how human memory will literally anchor itself to pop culture when your personal identity totally fails. But beyond the fractured memory, Benjamin was also suffering physically. He had these terrible, terrible cataracts, making him practically blind. For the longest time at the shelter, he could literally only see the floor immediately around his feet just to mop it. Well, eventually he was able to get cataract surgery to restore his vision. And this is a wild moment. When the bandages finally came off, he walked straight over to a mirror to look at himself for the very first time since waking up. And he was completely stunned. In his own mind, he honestly believed he was a young guy, somewhere in his 20s or 30s. But staring right back at him was the reflection of a man well over 60 years old. So the crucial point here is the bureaucratic nightmare Benjamin was trapped in. It really highlights this cruel, everyday reality. If you don't have a social security number, you're not really a person. Seriously, think about what that actually means for a second. Without that 9-digit number, he couldn't legally get a job anywhere. He couldn't sign a lease for an apartment. Later on, when he eventually moved to Jacksonville, Florida, he was actually turned away from homeless shelters simply because he didn't have a valid photo ID. The guy was literally forced to sleep out in a field behind a police station. Without a paper trail, society just didn't know how to process his existence. For all intents and purposes, he was a ghost in the system. Luckily, though, people did try to step in and help. A nurse at the shelter named Catherine Slater essentially made Benjamin her multi-year project.
She went as far as taking him right into her own home. She successfully fought the bureaucracy to get him onto the FBI's missing persons list, which, fun fact, made him the only person on that entire list whose exact whereabouts were actually known. She pushed hard with the media, eventually landing him a spot on the Dr. Phil show, really hoping someone in the national audience would recognize him. In exchange, Benjamin, who it turns out had this encyclopedic knowledge of how to fix commercial restaurant equipment, would do repairs around her house. But things got complicated. Over the years, he developed these severe hoarding tendencies, and sadly, their relationship really began to fracture. Catherine eventually started to suspect he wasn't really trying all that hard to find his true identity, and she ended up asking him to leave.
So the search for Benjamin's identity eventually had to pivot from daytime TV to hard science, and man, did it lead to an intense and highly public feud between two genealogists. On one side, you had Colleen Fitzgerald. She's a genetic researcher who actually managed to find some distant DNA links to a family named Powell, but then she just hit a massive wall. When Benjamin eventually cut ties with her, Colleen publicly expressed fears that maybe he was dangerous or hiding from some dark criminal past, and she outright refused to release his genealogical data back to him. On the other side of this was Cece Moore, a heavy-hitting expert in autosomal DNA. She stepped right in to defend Benjamin, publicly calling out Colleen's refusal to hand over the data as highly unethical. Her stance was clear: a patient has an absolute right to their own biological information, no matter what. Let's see how this all builds up, because it was Cece Moore's incredibly meticulous genetic detective work that finally cracked the 16-year mystery. Step 1. She managed to track down and contact a member of that distant Powell family right before they were having a huge family reunion. Step 2. She coordinated getting DNA samples from a bunch of the attendees at that reunion. Step 3. By cross-referencing all this fresh data, she pinpointed a specific branch of the family that had split off and moved to, you guessed it, Indiana, which perfectly lines up with Benjamin's memory of the 25-cent grilled cheese at the state fair. And finally, a little targeted old-school detective work led her to flip through the pages of a 1967 Jefferson High School yearbook from Lafayette, Indiana. And boom, there it was. Staring right back from the black and white pages of that 1967 yearbook was the face of the man with no name. Benjamin Kyle was finally definitively identified as William Burgess Powell. 16 full years after waking up completely naked, bloody, and clueless behind that dumpster, the guy finally had a true identity. He had a hometown. And maybe most incredibly, he learned he had brothers who had actually reported him missing and searched for him decades earlier, way back in 1976. And this brilliantly illustrates the psychology of why this all happened in the first place. Psychologists concluded that William had entered what is known as a dissociative fugue state. Basically, this is an involuntary, complete erasure of identity. Sufferers will often travel far away, they take on entirely new names and personalities, and they literally flee their old lives. In fact, the word fugue actually translates to flee. Think of it as the brain's ultimate extreme emergency brake. It's a defense mechanism designed to protect a person from overwhelming stress, highly painful memories, or severe trauma by completely 100% pulling the plug on their past. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wow, this sounds exactly like a Hollywood movie script, well, it actually inspired one. This highly rare fleeing condition has been documented in medical literature for well over a century. Just take the fascinating case of Ansel Bourne back in 1887. This guy stepped onto a streetcar in Rhode Island one day and literally woke up 8 weeks later in Pennsylvania running a convenience store under a completely different name. His specific case study became the literal inspiration for the famous fictional spy Jason Bourne. Just like Ansel Bourne, William Powell's mind simply checked out, packed its bags, and started over. But that begs the question, what exactly was William fleeing from? Well, the details of his early life provide a pretty somber explanation. His root trauma really stemmed from his childhood home. You see, his father was a World War II veteran who struggled terribly with severe alcoholism and these terrifying rage issues. And according to his own family members, that abuse was very frequently directed specifically toward William. It was just an incredibly painful, toxic environment, and it likely laid the deep psychological groundwork for his mind to eventually say enough and build a wall so high that it blocked out his entire existence. So, looking at everything we've uncovered, we can finally stitch together a verified timeline of his life. In 1976, he fails to show up for a family dinner, and his car is found abandoned near a dam, which kicks off that initial family search. We know for sure he fled to Colorado, because the very last person to definitively see him was a friend named Chico Getz in Boulder, all the way in 1977. From there, Social Security records show him earning money at various restaurants around the Denver area up until 1983, and then nothing. The paper trail completely and utterly stops. It just vanishes. The very next confirmed moment of this man's life is the year 2004, when he is found severely beaten behind that Burger King down in Georgia. Which, of course, leaves us with a massive, glaring, unsolved blank space. Between 1983 and 2004, there is a 21-year gap. Over 2 entire decades of a man's life completely unaccounted for. We don't know where he lived, we don't know what name he was using, who he met, or what he did every day. And honestly, most disturbingly, we still have absolutely no idea who beat him within an inch of his life, triggered his memory erasure, and left him for dead behind that dumpster. It is a really stark reminder of just how incredibly fragile human memory is, and how easily a person can just slip right through the cracks of the world. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know.